means a lot to me. My desire has always been to share practical information with God's people because God has gifted some of you to come alongside people, and this topic here in depression can be very, very helpful and very, very instructive for you. And anyone can help someone who's depressed if you'll take some of the things you learned today, and they're as practical as you're ever going to find, and put them into practice. Because you may have a gifting, you may have a desire to come alongside people, to encourage, to admonish, to support, but you just want the tools. And that's what I want to do. And that's what Pastor Dale wants, just as equip you to do the work of the ministry. So let's bow our heads together in prayer as we start. Father, we give this time to you. Ask, Father, that information that is given will be made into transformation. That you will do that, Father, and that you will encourage us with your personally spoken word to our hearts. And for those who are here this morning, Father, who may have been or may be in depression even as we speak, may this be an encouragement to them, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. When it comes to the subject of depression, that word is not used in Scripture. You won't find the word depression there. So you say, well, what are you going to find? Well, men in the Bible who were depressed used other words. They used words like downcast, cast down, brokenhearted, troubled, miserable, despairing, and mourning. Some of you wouldn't use those words, and yet those are words that typically in Bible times describe someone who was going through a very deep time, a very dark time, a very oppressive time. Now, David used an interesting expression. He said, "Why are you cast down, O my soul? Why are you disquieted in me? Hope in God. Oh my God, my soul is cast down." You've read that before. How many of you know what a cast sheep is like? Didn't think so. David was a shepherd. And as a shepherd, he worked with sheep a lot. My son has an agricultural bent. In fact, if you went to Oregon State University and checked in the ag department, you would find Dr. Jonathan Velez there. And if you went up to him and said to him, "Are you Dr. Jonathan Velez?" "Yes," he'd say. And I would want you to respond, "Who's your daddy?" And then just walk away. But he wanted to raise sheep. And when he was 12 years of age, he came up and said, "Dad, I want to raise some sheep." So I typically laid out a thing, because if I'm going to bankroll this, I told him about interest. I told him about how much I would give him and so forth, and what the return would be and all. I just played with it, had fun with it. And so he raised sheep, and he taught me a ton about sheep and green gold and how my pickup would smell differently for the rest of its days. But I learned about cast sheep as well. Now, let me tell you what a cast sheep is. When you raise sheep, one of the biggest dangers that a sheep has is in the springtime, because they're usually pregnant. They're just about ready to give birth, and the grass is growing. It's rich. It's green with nutrients. The sun is coming out, and it's easy for them to lie down. And when they lie down, it's easy for them to start to roll a little bit on their back, because the pregnancy that they're in causes all kinds of interesting complications. How many of you would be able to relate to that? Yes. And so they would roll over on their side. And if they roll over on their side, the gases build up in their stomach, and they go down their legs, and they close off some of the circulation. So their legs become stiff, and they can't get back up again. That's a picture of a cast sheep. If they stay that way, they will die. because the gas will continue to go up and they will just literally explode or implode, if you will. Not explode, but implode. And so a cast sheep is something that is a sheep that's on its back and it can't get on its feet. Now, David was a shepherd. He knew what cast sheep were like. And he knew that was something you always have to watch out for. And it's interesting, when he wrote Psalm 23, that is the only psalm in the Bible that's written from a sheep's point of view. It's not written from a human's point of view. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's written from a sheep's perspective. And the sheep said, well, let me tell you what you have to do with a cast sheep. You have to go to the cast sheep, go up to it, take it gently, try to get it on its legs, and then you have to lift and get her back up, and then rub her legs a little bit to get the circulation going again, and then watch her wobble away because that's the way she does it for just a little bit until she gets her feet back under her again. I actually had an experience with a cast sheep once, not with my son, but with when I was driving my family to the coast, and there was a field full of sheep out there, but most of the sheep were off in the distance, and about 75, 100 yards away, I saw one sheep that was doing this, just kept flailing and doing this. And I told my wife, I said, honey, I think that's a cast sheep. And so we parked the car, we went over the gate, not the fence, but the gate. Some of you men know what I'm talking about. And we went over the hinge side of the gate, okay? And got over there, and my family went with me, and we walked right up to her, and there she was. She couldn't get on her feet. So I lifted her up and started rubbing her feet like that, rubbing her legs a little bit. No sooner did I do that, and I saw at the corner of my eye a pickup that was screeching down the road, came up to where our car was parked, screeched to a halt, and it was the farmer. And he came out, and he's had people steal his lambs. So he was concerned, what are we doing in his field? And he came this way, we started going the other way. I started walking back, and we met in the middle. He said, what are you doing? I said, I saw one of your sheep was cast. And suddenly the expression on his face totally changed. And he realized I didn't want him to pick up a dead ewe and lose 2 lambs at the same time. And he was so grateful. He said, well, thank you, I appreciate that. And he said, which one? He said, that one there that's kind of wobbling, looked like she's drunk. You know, she was cast. But I think that's why David said in Psalm 23, he restoreth my soul. He gets me back up on my feet again. Anybody ever been cast? That's when he says, why are you cast down, O my soul? So when you understand what a cast sheep is like, then you can understand what we're talking about. So who were the people in Scripture who were depressed? Well, number one, David was. He lost his job, he lost his income, he lost his reputation, his family, his wives, his best friend. He had posters posted all over Jerusalem and all over Israel, said, David wanted, dead or alive. And then he said, there is no one who regards me, there is no escape for me. No one cares for my soul. That is a very deep place to be when you say, no one cares for my soul. And David poured his heart out before God in that cave and said, God, no one cares for me. And God said, I'll send someone to care for you. So who did God send to David? He sent men. Everyone that was in distress, everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented gathered themselves to David. I have to chuckle at that. Because David said, I need someone to encourage me. God says, I'll send you 400 more that need encouragement. And he did. And I look at those 3 Ds, distressed, debt, and discontented, and say, let me add another one. I think some of them were depressed. Isn't that fair to say? If you were in debt, you were in distress, and you were discontented, I think you might be depressed as well. But it's interesting to see that. Jonah was another one. He suffered incredible loss and devastation. And I think part of it was because he was a sign. I think there was disfigurement from his time in the belly of the fish. And he was a sign, Jesus said, unto the people. But he said, why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. Excuse me, this is Job. I'm sorry. I thought I had Jonah up there. There's Jonah. Here we go. Jonah. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. And he begged with all his soul to die, saying, death is better to me than life. Oh, that's heavy. And then Job, who suffered incredible loss and devastation. Why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. I loathe my very life. Therefore, I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. Those are heavy words. Job had the life experience to back those words up. Jeremiah, he lived alone, ministered alone, was poor, ridiculed, rejected by his people, and he was brutally honest and wrestled with despair and a sense of failure. He said, cursed be the day I was born. Why did I ever come out of the womb to see trouble and sorrow and to end my days in shame? Oh, man. Joseph, we don't always think of Joseph as depressed because we never see him in a depressed state of mind. But I looked at his life and I said he lost his father, lost his family, lost his language, lost his culture, lost his home. He was rejected by his brothers, lost his independence, lost his freedom, lost his ability to have choice, sold as a slave, maligned, imprisoned, and then when he was in prison, he was forgotten. And I thought, I think there might be some emotional repercussions from that. Is that stretching it too far to say there might be some emotional repercussions from those kinds of losses? It was huge. So I'm assuming that Joseph had some down days. And then Elijah, Lord, take my life from me, for I am no better than my ancestors. And Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. What does that say? It says that you don't have to be embarrassed when you're a Christian and you're depressed. Because there's a lot of men in the Bible. There's some I didn't even mention that I think probably went through depression. I think Abraham probably went through some times of doubt and discouragement. I almost guarantee you Moses did. I know Paul did. But these kinds of things happen. And depression is not an easy thing to deal with. So what do you do? And what do you say to somebody who's depressed? Well, I'll tell you what you don't say to them. Because you wouldn't say it to the men that I just mentioned before you. You wouldn't say, snap out of it. There's nothing to be depressed about. It's all in your head. You just need to try harder. It could be worse. Anybody here ever heard someone say some of those words to you? Yes. That doesn't help you, and it doesn't encourage you. So what I want to share with you is what God did and what God shared with people who were depressed. So we're going to go to Elijah's story and look at that story, and I'm going to show you a depression that Elijah went through and how God helped him through it, okay? So let me review 1 Kings 17 and 18. I'm not going to read that. I will read 1 Kings 19 to you a little bit, but not 1 Kings 17 and 18. So let me explain that to you. Elijah was a prophet. And he was a prophet to Israel. That was in the northern kingdom. The king of Israel at the time was a man named Ahab. He had a wife that was not a good lady, okay? She was Elvira on steroids, all right? If I can put it that way. She was, net stockings, high heel boots, stiletto heels. What else do I need to say about Jezebel? That's his wife, okay? So Jezebel was not a good woman, and Ahab was a wicked king. And God said to Elijah, I want you to go in, and I want you to tell Ahab that it's not going to rain for 3.5 years because of his sin. And he's led the people in the wrong way, and his wife has led the people in the wrong way. And so Elijah did what God said, walked in, pointed his bony finger in the face of King Ahab, and said, it's not going to rain for 3.5 years. And then Elijah walks out, stands on the front steps of the palace, and says, what do I do now, Lord? And I love the Lord's response. I'd go hide. I see humor in that. I don't know if you do, but I'd go hide. So he went to the brook Cherith, and there at the brook Cherith, God provided for him. 2 ravens took care of him until the time when the brook finally dried up. And then God sent him to a widow, and the widow lived in Zarephath. Now Zarephath, the name means smelting furnace. It was on the coast there near the Mediterranean Sea, and it was just about 3 miles or 4 miles south of Sidon. And Sidon was where Jezebel was born. Just south of Sidon was Zarephath, which means smelting furnace. They called it that because that's where they made idols to Baal, down there. The last place Ahab would have looked for Elijah, and he was a hunted man, would be in the very place where they make idols to Baal. And he was there. And that's where God wanted him to be, and taught him some valuable lessons. And then finally God said, okay, now I want you to show yourself to Ahab. Takes faith to do that. He wants to kill me. But he did. And he saw Ahab, and he said, Ahab, God is upset with what you've done. That's why it hasn't rained for 3.5 years, and the people are suffering. And he said, if you want to see something, you want to see who the real God is, he said, meet me with all of Israel on Mount Carmel, which isn't too far away from where they were. And we'll have a contest. You bring your prophets of Baal, and I will be there. And we'll see who answers by fire. And so they brought thousands of people up there on Mount Carmel, and they had a contest. And the followers of Baal built an altar, and they screamed, and they hollered, and they cried, and they cut themselves. And Elijah was mocking them and saying, cry louder, maybe he's asleep, and just went through all of that. And finally, at the end of the day, they said, we can't, God didn't answer by fire. Baal didn't answer by fire. And Elijah went to the old altar that used to be there for the Lord. And he rebuilt that, put the wood on it, put the sacrifice on it, and then he said, bring 4 barrels of water. They put 4 barrels on it. He said, bring 4 more barrels. Probably got the water from the Mediterranean. Put 4 more barrels. He said, bring 4 more barrels. Put 12 barrels of water on that. And then Elijah prayed. And when he prayed, he said, God, show them who you really are. And show them your power. Turn their hearts back to you. And boom, God answered prayer, and the heavens were split, and lightning came down, just destroyed, just burned up everything, even the rocks. And the people said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. National revival took over. It was huge. And so Elijah said, we got to kill the prophets of Baal. So they got all 850 prophets, and they killed them. Now you have to keep in mind, this was a time of chaos now, a time of upheaval, a time of people grabbing other people. It wasn't that the prophets all stood in line with saying, okay, it's my turn now. It wasn't that way. This was one incredibly stressful day. Have you ever had one incredibly stressful day? Apart from the day you were married, but have you ever had one incredibly stressful time? That's what they had. And so it was after all of this, that 1 Kings 19 comes into play. And I want to share this with you so that you can understand what just took place and what Elijah is going through. Now, Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me, and even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. Ooh. And he was afraid and arose, ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, it is enough. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers. He lay down and slept under a juniper tree, and behold, there was an angel touching him, and said to him, arise, eat. Then he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones, and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then he came there to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I've been very zealous for the Lord and the God of hosts and for the sons of Israel. I have forsaken your covenant and torn down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. So he said, go forth, stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking the pieces of the rock before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle voice. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, the sons of Israel, that have forsaken your covenant and torn down your... Same thing. And the Lord said, go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you've arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram. I look at that and I say to myself, how did God handle Elijah? Because Elijah was dealing with pretty heavy issues, pretty heavy depression. So let's look at the time of his depression. Number one, he wasn't depressed at the brook Cherith when he was alone and hunted and all comforts were removed from him. We have no indication that he went through a depressive time there. I think you may have questioned his food service because a raven is a scavenger bird, and they will scavenge things, take them, and that was what God chose to bring them. And I laugh when I think of that. They were flying, and he sees them off in the distance, and the raven comes and plops down, and waddles over and plops something down. Where'd you get that? You know, I can see the challenge of faith that might come with that. But, you know, we don't have any indication that he went through a depressive time there. We don't have any indication he went through a depressive time at the widow's house. None. And he wasn't depressed on Mount Carmel. He was depressed after a tremendous triumph. And we don't look at it that way, but Scripture makes it quite clear. It was after a tremendous triumph, after a huge weight of oppressive how do I want to put this? The weight of all of the sin of Israel seemed to rest on Elijah's shoulders. And he was physically and emotionally depleted. was empty. The weight of the nation was on his shoulders. 850 prophets of Baal were killed. Tremendous expenditure of physical energy. He was physically and emotionally exhausted, and therefore he was vulnerable. Now, let me explain something to you. When you're under stress, your body produces cortisol. Too much cortisol, and you get depressed. Do you think for a moment Elijah may have been under a tremendous amount of stress on Mount Carmel? Absolutely. Absolutely. And therefore, he was probably saturated. He was like a human sponge with cortisol. And then came the words from Jezebel. Physically, emotionally exhausted, batteries were depleted, and then the trigger. Always look for the trigger of depression. What is it that may have triggered it? There may have been other surrounding events, but what was the trigger? It was Jezebel's words. Someone's words or actions or threats, any form of verbal malpractice can trigger depression. Has anyone here ever been on the receiving end of verbal malpractice? Anybody? Yes. And that's really easy for you to get depressed. Someone's voice, someone's words, someone's unintentional oversight or inadvertent deed, that coupled with his weakened condition and fear crept in and distorted his thinking, that was the trigger. That's all he needed. Even though the national mood was against Jezebel. The tide had turned. He didn't look at that. He just looked at her words. And so he fled. He fled from Mount Carmel down to Beersheba, 113 miles. I Google mapped it. 113 miles. That's a long way to go. And so what's the torture of depression? Well, number one, there was fear. Fear of being alone, maybe. Fear of death. I like what Chuck Swindoll says about fear. He says, fear lurks in the shadows around every imaginable corner. Threatens to poison your inner peace and outward poise. It watches for your vulnerable moment, then it picks the lock and safeguards your security. Once inside, it strikes quickly to transform spiritual muscle into mental mush. And fear just overwhelmed him and just consumed Elijah in a big way. Not only was there fear, but there was anxiety and panic. A meteor shower of what ifs would go through your mind. What if this, and what if this, and what if this? And some of you have been there. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Your mind just races, and you're trying to get everything under control. And it's just racing at a breakneck speed. And then there was withdrawal. He fled to Beersheba. People take energy. And when you're depressed, you don't want to be around people. You want to withdraw from people. You need to get away from people because they do take energy. He didn't want to be around them, so he fled. And then he went into isolation. What did he do? It said when he got to Beersheba, he left his servant there and went by himself. Oh, how torturous that would have been. Left alone with no one to process anything with. He said, just leave me alone. I just want to get alone. I just want to get away. And his fear drove him into the wilderness by himself, where he was left alone to deal with his own torturous thoughts and emotions by himself. Not a fun place to be. And there he started comparing himself to others. I am no better than my fathers. They must have had more faith. They must have had more love. They must have been more joyful. What did they know that I didn't know? He started to compare himself with others. And we do that when we get depressed. That's a very common thing. We'll start comparing ourselves. So-and-so's happy. So-and-so's good. But I'm not living like that. That's not my experience. This is one of the biggest issues with social media right now in teenagers, especially teenage girls. The rate of suicide among teenage girls has doubled in the last 10 years. Doubled. And they've tied that directly to social media usage because they're comparing themselves with others on social media. It's huge. His focus was only on the negative. It's all or nothing thinking, mentally processing things through emotional mush, trying to filter out all the things that were going on for him, and he couldn't make hide nor hair out of anything. I put this in your notes. It's Beck's Cognitive Depression and Cognitive Distortions. It's a great little handout to look at to say what really happens mentally to us many times when we get into a heavy depression. All or nothing thinking. You see things in black and white. Overgeneralizing. We see a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. A mental filter, disqualifying the positive. We jump to conclusions. We magnify or we catastrophize or we minimize things. We emotionally reason. We go through should statements. I should have done this and why didn't I do that? And our mind is just racing, labeling and mislabeling, personalizing. There's so many things here that pretty much say that's exactly what's going to take place. And then finally, self-pity. Sitting under the gnarled limbs of that juniper tree, he was overwhelmed with self-pity. Oftentimes that takes over. The Apostle Paul faced a depressive time in his life. He said to the Corinthians, he said, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we even despaired of life." So he was there as well. So my question to you is, what causes depression? Well, I'm going to slip away from Scripture for a moment and just talk to you personally. What causes depression? First thing is genetic loading. What do I mean by that? You may have come that way from the factory. That's what I mean. You got that? If dad struggled with depression, or if mom struggled with depression, or if both mom and dad struggled with depression, you may be dealing with depression because you can be genetically loaded for depression. You can be genetically loaded for anxiety. You can be genetically loaded for dyslexia, bipolar, ADD, ADHD. There are so many things that are tied to genetics. That's one of the first things you have to look for. And sometimes I've come across folks that have said this to me: I felt like I've been depressed most of my life. That's a different kind of depression. That's not reactive. That's not a depression that's there reacting to someone's words or something happened, and you can't point to a specific thing that caused it, but they'll say, I feel like I've been depressed my whole life. Anybody ever heard someone say something like that? Yeah. Chances are they're emotionally loaded for depression and they may have dysthymia. Dysthymia is a long-term form of depression. They call it in the DSM persistent depressive disorder. I call it dysthymia because that's what it used to be called for years. But sometimes, think of Eeyore, okay? All right, now dysthymia isn't that bad. But if I were to say it's the person who walks around not at 98.6, but about 95 most of the time. That's their normal. Okay, it's like they've got just a slow or low level of emotional flu. Does that make sense? And if that's the case, call it what it is, because it might be dysthymia. And like I say, you may have come that way from the factory. And it's good to know that, because then you have to deal with that differently than you would a reactive depression. Does that make sense? So one of the first things you need to realize is when you're working with depressive people, you want to find out, where's this coming from? Okay? Do your homework. Do your homework. Don't think, well, what happened? And you look at the immediate and you don't look at the bigger picture. Pan the camera back and get the bigger picture of what's going on. So what else can cause it? Anemia, lack of iron, that can cause depression. Low blood sugar, lupus, diabetes, that's another physical thing. Those can be prone to cause you to be prone to depression. You want to make sure you eliminate that. Postpartum blues. Anybody here ever been pregnant? Anybody here ever had the baby blues, they call it? Okay, that's fairly common after pregnancy. Goodness, after you deliver a baby, just that process alone would cause me to be depressed for 10 years. You know, as a man watching that. Baby comes out, and how many of you have recognized that when a woman is pregnant, her body tends to change a little bit? Have you noticed that? Yeah. And when I teach Introduction to Human Growth and Development, I go through all of the changes that take place in their body. And then when I cover all of those, then I have a slide that says, we're not done yet. And they're going, oh, you're going to be kidding. There's so many more. But after the baby is born, their body goes back to its normal position, if you can call it that. Or you hope that it does. But sometimes the thyroid gland, right here, the base of the neck, which helps regulate mood, doesn't go back right away. It doesn't reboot just like it was before you got pregnant. So if someone came to me, and if it was a woman, and I knew she had a baby within a year, or within 2 years, really, within 2 years, I would always want to know if she's had a blood test to find out whether her thyroid is low. Because she'll have no energy. Your fingernails will become more brittle. More hair will come out in the shower than you want it to. Some of you say, you're describing old age right now. You're more sensitive to cold. And you can get an underactive thyroid, and that can cause hypothyroidism. And so that's one thing you'd want to eliminate. That can cause depression. And you can always just jump to the spiritual or jump to the psychological, but don't do that. You know, God has put us in bodies, and those bodies alter and change and shift, and we need to recognize that. Upsetting life events, that's important for us to know that that can cause depression. I think we're pretty much familiar with that. Bitterness, hatred, sin, guilt. David said in Psalm 32, day and night, because he was holding things in from his sin with Bathsheba, day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My moisture is turned into the drought of summer. My bones have waxed old through their roaring all the day long. Sometimes you can be depressed because of something you've done and value systems that you've stepped over and stepped on. I like what Irma Bombeck says. She's my favorite theologian. Guilt is the gift that keeps on giving. And that's so true. And then medications. Polypharmacy. Some of you say, what's that mean, polypharmacy? If you take medications, that can cause you to be depressed. Usually there's a side effect. They have a little piece of paper that's folded by, I don't know who folds it, but it takes you an hour to unfold it, and then you read it. It's 2-point font, and you read that, and almost invariably they'll put under side effects depression. You need to recognize that. What medications are you on? Are they prone to causing depression? And then if they mix those medications, oh my goodness, that's what polypharmacy is. Because sometimes they'll give you a medication and you might have a side effect from it, so they'll say, well, let me give you another medication to help you with that side effect. And then you take that medication to help you with the side effect, and then it gives you another side effect, so they give you a third medication to help you with the side effect of the first medication.
And then you go to the ED and they give you all other meds.
Yeah. I had a gal, this is 30 years ago, so I think it's safe to say, but she wanted to end it. And I asked her if she would be willing to take a physical. No, I don't need a physical, I just want to die. Eventually, I had to take her to the hospital myself. Only time I ever done that. But I had my secretary get in the car with me, and I said, okay, let's go. Because she was there. And I took her there, and I wrote down all the medication she was on, handed it to the nurse, intake nurse. He said, 8? And I said, that's her meds. And so they kept her there. 2 days later, her son showed up at my door, thanking me profusely for taking his mom to the hospital. He said she was borderline diabetic, bouncing in and out. And that's why she wanted to end her life. Go get a blood test. Go get a physical. Go get thoroughly checked out. You always start with the physical. Always do that. All right? And then polypharmacy, mixing medications can cause problems. I got rear-ended on Foster Road one time. And it wasn't a big accident, but it was enough to, pop your back enough. And 3 weeks later, I was in excruciating pain. Went to my doctor. He gave me Scalaxin, a muscle relaxant. It didn't really reduce it that much. But then I went to a doctor, and he gave me that high-powered steroid. Starts with a P. Always forget it. Prednisone. Thank you. He gave me prednisone. I took prednisone. And I didn't know at the time it had a very high caffeine-like effect. And then I was on prednisone, Scalaxin, and then I drank a latte just before I went to teach abnormal psychology. And I was ripping. I mean, words came quickly. I was going, and halfway through, and I've never done this, but halfway through, I stopped and I said to the class, is my teaching different today? No one said a word. They just went. And I said, I'm on Scalaxin, and I got rear-ended, and my back was hurting, and I was in pain, and then I drank a latte. I said, I think I'm high. And I says, if this is what it's like to be high, I like it. And they laughed, But I said, look, let's just dismiss class. And so we dismissed the class, I'll be honest with them. It felt good, to do that like that. Because I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do any of that stuff, But that was different. But, mixing medications can do that. And then finally the doctor, Kaiser, said, prednisone has a very high caffeine-like impact on you. So be aware of that. Just be aware of that. That can cause depression as well. So those are the kind of things that can do that. So if I say that to you, where did God start? Well, God started with tending to the body. Didn't he? And God tended to his body. So you always start with the physical. And God said, I want you to rest. Sleep. He fed him and then said, now sleep. Just get some rest. And then watch this. He walked up to him. Do you mind if I do this? Okay. He walked up to Elijah. Elijah's sleeping. Just tilt your head a little to the side. Yeah. Elijah's sleeping. And it says, and the angel touched him. Hey, Elijah. Hey, I like that. That's tender, isn't it? Didn't kick him and say, hey, get up. He touched him. God deals with people who are hurting with tenderness. You got that? The angel touched him, woke him up, and said, here, eat and drink again. Some water and here's some good food, and then go back and rest some more. God started with the physical. That's important. I ask people, what'd you have for breakfast? I had a latte. What'd you have for lunch? I ate a Snickers bar. When you're depressed, you don't eat right. How many of you have ever noticed that? Yeah, you will go through a half a bag of potato chips in a heartbeat. Some of you don't have to be depressed to do that. You just do it anyway, I'd say go a half gallon of ice cream, but the half gallons have shrunk now. They're less than a half gallon. My wife brought something home the other day, and I said, what is that? She says, that's a half gallon. I said, no, it isn't. And we looked, and sure enough, they kept the same price, but they reduced the content. But we do that. We do that. And sometimes people come to you, and they've got all kinds of things that they've been eating, and you say, no wonder why your body's acting up. Sugar. Sugar is kind of an interesting thing. It creates an inflammatory reaction, not only on your body, but on your mind. And in that study in 2017, men who consumed 67 grams were 23% more likely to be diagnosed with depression than those who consumed 40 grams or less. It's kind of an interesting thing. Who would have thought that? But we tend to do that many times. When you're depressed, your sleeping gets disturbed. You sleep too little, or you sleep too much, or it's not restful. Now, let me explain to you how your sleeping patterns work, okay? This is going to throw out some $50 words. I like nickel words, but sometimes $50 words are in the picture, so I'll throw out a couple of them for you. When it starts to get dark, I'm going to teach you this just like I do my college students, okay? So I'm going to treat you just like your college students. Here we go, because I do this to keep them awake. When you go to sleep at night, light goes through your eye. It goes through a cluster of neurons called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. You can go all day and not have to know that. But it does. It goes through that. And that triggers some reactions, and it goes and it hits your pineal gland. Now, your pineal gland is about that big, from my thumb up, just a little tiny pine cone-shaped gland, right in smack dab in the middle of your brain. The Egyptians called that the third eye. And ironically, it has rods in it, just like in your eyes. But when it goes and it starts to get dark, it activates that pineal gland. And your pineal gland, once it's activated, secretes a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin only comes out at night. So you know what they call it? The Dracula of the hormones. Yeah, because it only comes out at night. So when it gets dark, it secretes the melatonin. The melatonin goes and sits on a park bench in your brain. Serotonin, which is a mood neurotransmitter, sits on the same park bench. And they make out. Now all my college students are going, okay, go on, you know. And they make out. What I mean, they mix together. And when they mix together, have you ever laid down in bed and for just a millisecond, you got a little fuzzy-headed feeling like you were going to drift off to sleep? Has that ever happened to you? That's because someone's making out in your brain. Yeah. Melatonin and serotonin are mixing together, and you, and off to sleep you go. When you get depressed, your body cannibalizes the serotonin. It needs as much of it as it can get. So, melatonin, when it shows up there, it sits on that park bench, a little serotonin gets up there like a little tiny midget swinging its little legs, and it doesn't show up in full strength. And it says, ain't nothing going to happen here. And it impacts your sleep. Does that make sense? So you sleep too much, you sleep too little, or it won't be restful. And you'll be exhausted because of the Dracula of the hormones as it comes out and affects everything else as well. So that helps you a little bit there. Now, 10% of your serotonin is produced in your brain. 90% is produced in your gut. So don't tell your mother I said this, but she was right. You are what you eat, and you need to eat your vegetables. Because 90% of the very thing that stabilizes your moods comes from your gut. And if you just pour a ton of Red Bull in there, and well, I'm not stepping on toes now, and a ton of all the stuff that we get to jack ourselves up and make our adrenal glands just stand up on edge and just freak out, you know. It's no wonder we struggle with depression. So, there's omega-3 fish oil is really high correlation between omega-3 and fish oil stuff with with better health and not less depression. Exercise builds up serotonin. You go exercise and you're done and you go, oh man, I feel good. One of the reasons you feel good is not because your muscles are all warm, it's because that helps build up serotonin in your body. So you feel good. Chia seed, you know the thing you see at Christmas time? Chia pets, all that stuff. Don't put it on a piece of pottery and wet it and watch it grow in your window. Rip that stuff off and eat it. Because those chia seeds are expensive. They come from Mexico. But they're really rich in omega-3s. Golden flaxseed, stress B multiple vitamins, things like that. All of those things can be helpful. Now, am I saying that's going to solve your depression issues? No. Can it help? Yes. Because you're slowly building your body up. Is there a time when medication might be helpful? Yes. Do you always recommend medication? No. Some antidepressants can cause you to get depressed.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
How can you address how you deal with marijuana? Because I have lots and lots of people that are, even Christians, that are using marijuana because they seem depressed.
Okay. The question was, can you address depression and marijuana? It's okay. I don't know if we're going to get through this. What time is supposed to be done at 10, right? Oh, geez. We may have to do part 2 on this. I'm serious on that. But I want to answer your question. Marijuana is a depressant itself, okay? It is a depressant. Not a lot of studies have been done on marijuana because it's listed by the federal government as a class 1 drug, up there with heroin and cocaine. All right? There is one place in the country that has been authorized to do tests on marijuana, and that's the University of Mississippi. Why them? I don't know, but somehow they got the contract so that they could do studies. Studies have started to come in on marijuana use now. But again, it's kind of a under the rug kind of a thing, because marijuana, even though it's legal in the state of Oregon, it's not allowed. It's not allowed. It's legal in the state of Oregon. They can't deposit money in banks because federal stuff like that. Federal and the states are going to clash here over that. Now, back to the issue. Marijuana is a depressant. It slows your system down. Okay? So people say, well, it relaxes me. It helps me feel better. And there may be some medical benefits to it. Okay? I'm not saying that there aren't. But I will tell you this. Of the studies that have been done, there are 2 things that have been verified. Now, I sat through a drug seminar in the Hilton with about 250 people that were doing drug work all over Portland, and listened to a speaker share all of this kind of information. And he said the 2 studies that have been verified are that marijuana does have 4 times more tar in it than cigarettes. So everybody's against cigarettes, but marijuana has 4 times the amount of tar in it than cigarettes. And he said the second thing that comes about, and I don't know if this will get you depressed or not. If you're a guy, it would probably get you depressed. But you have a 70% higher risk of testicular cancer with marijuana usage. 70% higher risk of testicular cancer. Sperm counts are down 35% for mild users, 55% for moderate users. If I had the time, I would go through with you a little clip a little cartoon type clip on epigenetics. And epigenetics is something, in other words, epi means on genetics. You cannot alter your DNA, but you can alter the expression of that DNA, which means that you can do things and engage in things now as an adult that you will then create the opportunity for your children to not even have a choice in that area. They will be pre-programmed to do the very thing that you've been engaged in, and that choice will be taken away from them because you have tweaked the genetics and how it's expressed. Does that make sense? Don't have time to do that, and time has gotten away from me here, but we're not even finished with the depression thing, so we're going to have to do depression part 1 and depression part 2. Is that okay? All right. So I don't know if that answers your question, but marijuana, in my estimation, is a Trojan horse. It comes in, everyone told you everything about it was fine, everything's no problem, it's just better than cigarettes and all this stuff. It's not true. It's not true. There may be some medical benefits from it for some people, but the side effects are pretty disastrous. And they have done some studies, one in Australia, showing that teenagers who were prone to having psychosis and schizophrenia in their homes, in their families, and in their histories would be about 2 years ahead of schedule to introduce psychosis into their own lives by ingesting marijuana, doing that. So, all right, tend to the body. That's so important to do, all right? Let's see if we can get along here. It takes time. Time is important. It takes time to heal. Give yourself time. Cut back on all activities. Conserve your strength. You're going through a major depression. That's not something that you want to play with. But give yourself time. Be patient. Number 3, talking. Verbally processing. When you talk to people who are depressed, ask them what questions. What questions draw out information? Why questions infer guilt? Where did you learn that from? From God's Word. What are you doing here, Elijah? It's what you said to your kids. What did Mommy tell you to do? What did you do? What do you think Mommy's going to do now? What do you think that's going to feel like? You what them to death because you've learned that. Why did you do that? I don't know. Why is just throw them into the Adam thing of guilt dumping and blaming other people. But what questions draw out information? What are you doing here, Elijah? Now, you have to be careful because you can make a what question a why question. What in the world were you thinking? That's really an embedded why question. Get it off your chest. So, I have a Pepsi. I like Pepsi, not necessarily cherry, but it was on sale. So, here is a cherry Pepsi, okay? Does anybody want to come up here and open this up? No, you're all shaking your heads, no. Every person you talk to who's depressed is like this. On the inside. You can imagine what's on the inside. And you have to make a decision. What am I going to do about that? Well, there are some radical people, radical Christians that say, I'm going to pop that lid. We get this thing fixed. Slap that Nike motto on their forehead and send them out the door. Yeah, but if you take that Pepsi, you gently open your refrigerator and place it there, cold Pepsi won't explode. Warm Pepsi does. Maybe if I created an environment that allowed for things to change, maybe that would be a helpful tool. Make sense? Maybe if I just ever so slowly found a little opening so that some of the pressure could come out. Just a little tiny opening. Maybe that would be the place to start. But how do I get there? And how do I do that? It's so important that we treat people who are depressed with sensitivity. That make sense? It's so important that we do that. So, you don't just pop that lid off. Someone can take that home with you if you want to and stick it in your fridge. And you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But remember this. You want to help someone who's depressed, and your first thought is to do this. Well, let me tell you this, and tell you this, and tell you this. And if I tell you all these things, you're going to feel better. No, because something has to come out before you can put something in. Does that make sense? There is no room for them to take all the things that you're saying. And when you're depressed, you selectively hear certain things. There's things you will block out. You'll just hear just certain issues. You will not hear everything that's being said. But please remember that shaken Pepsi can. Something has to come out before you can put something else in. All right? Let me rip through this real quick. I put this together. If you're interested in wanting to get one of these, you can see Tania. But there's 92 different feelings divided into feeling families. The closer you are to angry, the more intense the feeling, less intense, least intense. See the difference in the fonts? So I did that because I try to help people identify what they're feeling because I want to do it gently. But sometimes people will say, I don't know what I'm feeling. How many of you ever heard someone say that? How many of you have ever said that? Yes, I don't know what I'm feeling. So I use this, and I say, well, tell me what you don't feel. Huh? Tell me what you don't feel. People who struggle with identifying what they do feel, especially when they're depressed, will not have problems telling you what they don't feel. Well, I don't feel appreciated, I don't feel worthwhile, I don't feel very respected. The opposite of that is over here. The opposite of scared is safe. The opposite of sad. You see what I'm saying? So you can go in the back door and try to help them understand what they're feeling by going in and finding out what they don't feel. That's important. All right, let me wrap it up here. We don't have time to finish everything. Tend to the body. That's what God did. It takes time to heal. God was never pushing Elijah. He wanted him to take the time to heal. Talking, getting out the what questions. Tears. Stress produces cortisol. Cortisol, when it saturates your brain, you will be depressed because it is a stress hormone that just does havoc on your brain. When you cry, there is a very high content of cortisol in tears. Oh no, I made them cry. Good. Why? They're getting the stress out. How many of you have ever had a good cry? Anybody ever have a good cry? What made it good? I got the cortisol out. So tears are important. I never someone starts crying, here's a box of Kleenex. Here, I don't want you to cry. No, you cry all you want. That's important. And lastly, truth. Balanced physical, psychological, emotional, relational, spiritual truth. Things that are important. Music would be in there. When I've been depressed, I can't read my Bible. I can't get anything out of my Bible. I'll go to that book right there. Streams in the Desert. It's a devotional. It's very simple. But when I'm not depressed, I don't gravitate toward that. When I am depressed, boom, that's the book I want to pick up. Chiang Kai-shek, who took a bunch of Chinese folks to Taiwan to flee communism, is buried with his Bible and that book. And I feel like I know why. God has used that many, many times to uplift me because I couldn't read Scripture at the time. I needed to, but I didn't have the energy to. I needed someone to come alongside me and just whisper in my ear. Okay? There's so much more, but I'm going to have to stop here. But let me help you all I can. Please work with people who are depressed in a tender way, but in a way that's knowledgeable. Always start with the physical. And there's a lot of practical suggestions that I have on the rest of your slides. And always look for anger, for stress, and grief and loss issues. Because those are the three main things that can cause people to get depressed. Anger, that they turn in on themselves. Grief and loss issues, which are fairly normal. And then stress. How much stress is going on there? And next week we'll talk about when it's deeper than anger. When it's deeper than anger. Okay? Thank you so much for coming. Uh-huh.